6 Tenant Stories. Story 1. 6 years ago, at the tender age of 29, I became the receiver of my grandfather's house after he passed away. It was very surprising, if I'm honest, but the story is that shortly before he died, he modified his will so that my parents could receive most of their money, while I received full ownership of their old Georgian home. I think the idea was that since my parents already had their own home, passing their house on to me was a way to help me get into the real estate market early. I appreciated the gesture at the time and still appreciate it now. I still live in that house. In fact, it's where I'm writing this right now. But when I first inherited it, it left me with a problem. I wasn't exactly doing well financially at the time, and when you're no longer renting, there's no landlord to call whenever something goes wrong in your home. I learned very quickly that I was living in a place beyond my means. In addition to taking overtime at work and fighting for a promotion, I needed quick money. And that, boys and girls, is how I became a very young and very hesitant owner. It turned out that the basement of my grandfather's old house had some plumbing installations and that, with a little work, it could be converted into a one-bedroom apartment. It would be small, just a shelter type really, but I could easily advertise it for around 3,000 to 5,000 pesos a month, which would cover all my bills and council tax with a little bit to spare. Fixing up the place was an investment, and I put in quite a bit of money from my grandfather's estate to make it not only a livable space, but also quite cozy. My philosophy was that if I wouldn't be excited to live there if I were a few years younger, I wouldn't ask more than 3,000 pesos a month for him. I wanted to make a little more money, not become a one-room landlord and a shoddy landlord. And I thought a nicer property would attract nicer tenants. I like to think I was right about it too, because my first tenant was this lovely grad student. But then, with all the lockdowns that came in at that time, and as we all know, that dramatically changed the financial situation of many people. My lovely graduate student had to move, and it may sound a little silly, but losing those 3,000 pesos a month was a huge blow to my pocketbook. I was at home all the time, so my bills went up, and because it was a coronavirus, I just couldn't find anyone to move in as everyone was basically paralyzed by all the restrictions. Things only started to loosen up again around Christmas, and by that time I was absolutely desperate for a tenant. Then, after posting a new ad on various rental websites, I received a request from a guy named Stefan. Stefan wasn't his real name, but he was a young Romanian, so I chose a Romanian name at random to maintain anonymity. And for reasons that become obvious as the story progresses, Stefan seemed shy and quite artistic, but other than that, that was all I really knew about him. Many landlords will ask for proof of income and, for foreigners, a copy of his visa and all that stuff. But I was only interested in whether Stefan could pay the deposit and the first month's rent in advance. That would have covered me for the Christmas period. And if I had problems with Stefan afterwards, then so be it. But he paid the next month and the next, and for his 4th or 5th month living in the basement, he was more than happy to extend a 6-month contract to an indefinite one. I had no idea what Stefan did for a living. All I knew was that I traveled to Edinburgh a lot and always paid the rent on time. Everything else was none of my business. I also have to emphasize how calm Stefan was. Half the reason I didn't know anything about him was because we never saw each other. Occasionally, on the first day of the month, I would just slide an envelope full of cash through my mailbox, and that was the most interactive thing I would have with it all month. I didn't think he was actively trying to avoid me. I just thought that's how he was. I was out a lot, never played loud music, and always paid rent on time. In many respects, he was an ideal tenant. But then, around month 7 or 8 in the late summer of 2021, I started noticing some stranger and stranger things. The first was that Stefan seemed to be getting a lot of deliveries to his flat. The entrance to his flat was right outside my living room window, and one morning I saw a delivery truck at the end of the road while Stefan was signing something on a large cardboard pallet. It looked like IKEA furniture or something, and she looked at me as I carried it back to her door, but I just gestured and that was it. Another strange thing about Stefan was that, when we met, Sometimes he just wouldn't return my greeting. I would say good morning or ask if he was okay, and he would just look at me without answering. The first few times I just thought I was a little shy or something, but then it got to the point where I thought it might be some kind of language barrier. The Scottish accent isn't the easiest to understand, and like I said, I chalked it up to a kind of communication barrier at first, but after a while I started to think something was a bit odd about Stefan. I know he wasn't obligated to talk to me or anything like that. It's just something I reflect on now, and I think maybe I should have paid a little more attention to that. But coming back to deliveries, there was one time he was getting one day and he mostly stayed to sign them himself, but then one day something came to him and he wasn't there to sign it. The delivery man then knocked on my door and asked me if I would take care of it for the tenant. I told him there was no problem, signed the item, and then found out it was another large flat cardboard package. So big that I needed the delivery man's help to get it safely into my hallway without dropping it. I kept it at my house until I saw Stefan come home later that night and let him know I had his package. Instead of thanking me or whatever, he seemed almost panicked immediately and immediately asked me if I had opened it in a very accusatory way. I was a little surprised and told him that I hadn't looked at his package, and if I'm honest, I resented the accusation a bit. I told him that too, not in an aggressive way, but just to make it clear that I wasn't that kind of owner or that kind of guy, and he seemed to calm down after that and muttered something about the contents being expensive. That was the last time I saw or spoke to Stefan before the incident. But before that, there was one more thing that made my concern increase before that big incident. One day I went down to the local main street to buy a few liters of milk. It's a short walk, 10 minutes there, 10 minutes here. But then, as I was coming back with my bottles of milk, I saw someone pull into the driveway of my house. It definitely wasn't Stefan, so I picked up my pace a little bit just to see who he was and what he wanted. When I got to my driveway, I saw this guy in a light-colored jacket and red hair, and he was just looking at my house as I slowly walked down the driveway. I asked him, "Can I help you?" And he almost jumped in fright before turning to look at me. I was trying to be as friendly as possible, but I was still a little wary of this guy, because he was on my property randomly and was acting anxious and nervous, which to me wasn't a good sign. I started backing up a bit, asking him if we had any problems, and he used the space I gave him to run down the driveway and suddenly disappeared from my sight. I went outside to try to see where I had run, but when I looked, I was nowhere to be found. I called the police just to put it on the record. He wasn't exaggerating or demanding a visit from the agents. He was just letting them know in case it happened again, at which point they would know it was an ongoing situation and therefore a more urgent situation. Anyway, I checked it in, and then shortly after, Stefan comes home, and right at the window I tell him about the weird guy in the driveway just so he's warned if it happened again. I caught him in the driveway, told him about the guy, and he immediately started acting a little nervous. The way I see it, if Stefan didn't know him, he would have acted as unselfish in me as he always did, but he didn't. In fact, he stopped and chatted with me as much as Stefan was capable of anyway. I started telling him what the guy looked like, and there was a definite look of recognition in his eyes, despite his attempts to hide it. But then I asked him if he knew the guy or if there was anything he needed to know about him. Stefan shook his head and then continued towards the basement. I was a little upset, to be honest. He could tell he was lying when he shook his head. But then again, what was he going to do? Questioning? If he didn't want to tell me, he wouldn't tell me, and the best he could do was make it clear that he would call the police again if there was an unwanted visitor, and that would be much less likely if he knew. I told him who I was. I felt like that gave Stefan a smooth start, so to speak. Just tell me who he is and why he's hanging around, and I'll try not to get him arrested. But again, he just nodded and walked away like he didn't want to tell me, and at that point I knew he wasn't done. I knew this guy had come looking for Stefan, and I was almost sure of that. It was just a matter of why it didn't look dangerous or something. I wasn't exactly scared. I just felt a little uncomfortable with a stranger hanging around my property when I wasn't around. Anyway, a few weeks went by and there was no sign of our nervous red-haired friend at all, so I started to basically forget that his visit had happened at all, and obviously Stefan had dealt with the situation because the old red-haired guy hadn't shown up again, and if he hadn't dealt with him and the red-haired visitor had just lost interest, well, it had worked the same way anyway. So then, on a Friday night, I once again went down to the pub to see some of my old friends. I only went for a pint or two since it was a last-minute invitation, but then more and more of my old friends started showing up, so I stayed longer and later until, I admit, I was at least over 70% drunk. And at that moment, I came to my senses and went home before closing. Like I said, it was a little worse for wear and tear, so I put on my headphones, listened to a few songs on the way back, and I'm pretty sure I was singing along when I got to my driveway. In fact, I know I was singing along because I was in exactly the third verse of Glenn Campbell's Southern Nights when I got to my living room, pulled out my headphones, and then tried connecting the Bluetooth to my old speakers so I could get on with my solo karaoke night. But then, in the small interval of silence between the song and the speakers, I heard something else that caught my attention. I thought I was freaking out at first, so I paused the music and stood quietly just stretching my ears until I figured out what it was. It was the sound of music coming from the basement. For the first time, Stefan was playing music so loud he could actually hear it. Come to think of it, it was the first time I heard Stefan do anything at all. And I assumed he was just playing his music that loud because he thought I was going to be out all night, which, to be fair, wasn't entirely out of the ordinary for me. I could hear the kind of low, loud bang of his music, some kind of EDM beat, so I thought he might have been having some sort of party. I didn't mind, but her small basement apartment didn't even have room to move around, let alone have an actual party. I guess I was feeling a little sociable, so I stepped out into the driveway and looked over the railings to where the window of his small kitchen was. I know it's a bit of an intrusion, but I was drunk, curious, and honestly wanted to keep the party going a bit. So there I went. But when I looked, I didn't see anyone in Stefan's small kitchen, which meant it must have been a fairly small gathering confined to the bedroom, which was probably the most spacious room in the apartment. I was feeling like a pervert at the time, so I went back inside, turned up the volume on my own music, and then went to the kitchen to make myself some food. I was doing my thing in the kitchen, but I was still thinking about Stefan and his little party that was happening downstairs. I knew next to nothing about the guy, and assuming he wasn't just playing his music that loudly on his own, I was happy that he finally had some social life. I definitely didn't want to be the sinister landlord trying to intrude on his personal life. Nor was it. So I resigned myself to having one last beer with my meal and then went to bed. So I heated up some chicken thighs in the microwave, grabbed a final beer from the fridge, and then saw some junk on TV while eating. Then, when I was done, I washed the dishes, went back to the TV room, and turned everything off. Now, once again, I'm standing quietly and I can hear that same thump, thump, thump of Stefan's music from below, but then that time it was accompanied by another, much less rhythmic noise that sounded a lot like someone screaming. It was a voice that was clear, but after I got down on my knees and put my ear closer to the floorboards, I realized that it sounded more like screaming, and at that point I had a moment of real a kind of moment that was probably slowed down by how drunk I still was, but eventually I realized that I had to go down to Stefan's apartment and see if everything was okay because whoever was screaming down there was obviously in great suffering and wouldn't shut up anytime soon. I ran outside, went downstairs to Stefan's apartment, and then when I heard, I could still hear the screams. I knew it was urgent, seriously urgent, so I started calling Stefan, "I'm going in, wait," and that's what I did. I knocked on his door again and again, almost falling again a couple of times, but I managed to open that door. The man was still screaming when the door slammed open and the music kept playing too, but he could barely hear it at all because he was so focused on those horrible screams. There was no one in Stefan's kitchen and dining area, so the only place left to look at was the bedroom, which was also where the music and screaming came from. So I hurried to the bedroom, looked around the threshold, and the first thing that caught my attention was the man who was screaming. He was sitting with his back against the bedroom wall, His knees pressed to his chest, and I didn't see him at first, but he was tied to the wall by something around his neck. It was short, keeping him low and close to the wall, basically forcing him into the position he was in, and when he saw me, we stared at each other for the briefest moment. Something about his eyes seemed strangely familiar. Then, once again, all I could hear were those screams. After he had seen me, instead of just screaming speechlessly, he began to beg me in these shrieks to take him away from me, please, to take him away from me. I would have done it, I really would have. I had no idea what was going on, but I was terrified of the guy, until I saw Stefan across the room. He was there, not a shred of clothing, with more blood than I had ever seen in my life around him, and the handle of what I assumed was a knife sticking out of his stomach. There was so much blood soaked on the carpet that it looked thick as mud, and her eyes were wide open. I mean, wide open, like he'd lost consciousness with this look of surprise on his face. In an instant, the man's plea screaming for it to be taken away was no longer so appealing. I assumed that if I took that device off his neck, it would do to me what he had just done to Stefan, and, as you can imagine, I didn't feel like that at all. So instead of doing what he was begging me to do, I just ran out of the apartment and ran as fast as I could toward my house. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had just witnessed, but I also couldn't afford to stay and face whatever was happening there. I got to my house, went in, and locked the door behind me. I sat on the couch, trying to process everything I had just seen. It was as if he was in shock, unable to fully comprehend the gravity of the situation. After a few minutes, I picked up my phone and called 911. I explained to the dispatcher what had happened in Stefan's apartment, trying to stay calm despite my emotional state. I gave them the address and begged them to send help as quickly as possible. They told me they would send the police and an ambulance immediately. As I waited for help to arrive, my mind was filled with questions. What the hell had I just witnessed? Who was this man who was screaming, and what had Stefan done to him? I felt guilty for running away, but at the time, all I could think about was staying safe. Finally, I heard the sirens of the police and the ambulance approaching. I got up from the couch and left my house to meet them. I directed them to Stefan's apartment and explained what I had seen. The officers entered the apartment and shortly after came out with the man who had been screaming. He was clearly traumatized, but he seemed to be out of danger. The ambulance quickly took him away for medical attention. Then, the agents entered Stefan's apartment again. I was waiting outside, feeling helpless as they tried to unravel what had happened. I couldn't help but wonder if there was anything I could have done to prevent this tragedy. After a while, the agents left the apartment with a grim expression on their faces. They informed me that Stefan's body had been found in his bedroom. He had died from his wounds. I was overwhelmed with sadness and guilt. If only I had acted differently, maybe I could have prevented this from happening. But I couldn't go back in time and change things. I could only face reality and try to move on. The police continued to investigate what happened in Stefan's apartment, but I never really knew what happened. I tried to move on with my life, but the memory of that night will always haunt me. I will never forget the terror I felt as I witnessed that horrific scene, nor the sense of helplessness that consumed me as I fled the situation. Days passed after the incident, but the shock and horror of what had happened was still fresh in my mind. I couldn't help but wonder how I had gotten to this point. How did a simple gesture of goodwill by turning the basement of my house into a rentable apartment end in tragedy? I felt guilty for not having intervened sooner, for not having investigated Stefan and his activities further. Could he have spotted any warning signs that something was wrong? I was haunted by these questions, but I couldn't change the past. The police continued their investigation, collecting evidence and talking to witnesses, including me. I was relieved that they were working to solve the case, but I was also overcome by a deep sense of sadness over the loss of Stefan. Meanwhile, life in my house went on, but it was no longer the same. The basement that was once a quiet apartment was now empty, its silent walls seeming to whisper the secrets of what had transpired there. I decided I would not rent the apartment again. The thought of having someone else living there after what had happened was unbearable to me. Instead, I turned it into a storage space, closing the door and trying to leave painful memories behind. But even though I tried to move on, the ghost of that night kept lurking in the shadows of my mind. I wondered if I would ever find peace, if I would ever be able to let go of the weight of what I had witnessed. Over time, life returned to normal to some extent. I tried to focus on my work and keep myself busy so I don't think about the past. But there would always be a part of me that would carry the weight of what had happened on that fateful night in the basement of my house. Story 2. In the late 1980s, around the time my first child was born, I used to work for a fairly large property management company in Monterey. We managed about 100 to 150 rental apartments and homes at any one time, and my team was in charge of scheduling and conducting the viewings for prospective tenants. I had a fairly large team under my supervision, and we were very close-knit, which made what happened in the fall of '89 even harder to bear. I worked with a team of very talented young men and women, but perhaps one of the brightest I worked with was a young woman named Valeria. Valeria was by far the best talent we had on staff during the fall of '89. I could close almost anything. I used to put her on visits to a place we'd had trouble filling, and within a few days, Valeria had a confirmed tenant. The same applied to the most exclusive properties, where an empty unit meant thousands of pesos lost each month. I put it on it, and voila, we had a tenant in a matter of weeks, sometimes days if the market was good. So when I got a call about one of our six-figure executive apartments in one of the new downtown skyscrapers, I knew Valeria was the right one for the job. The place was probably one of the most expensive properties in our portfolio and had been vacant for almost 3 months at the time, so filling it would be a huge win for both my team and the company as a whole. So on the day of the visit, I called Valeria in the morning to make sure the appointment was still scheduled, and then wished her the best of luck. Not that I needed it, but I always found it best to create as positive an environment as possible, especially when it came to sales prospects. After hanging up the phone, I simply waited until the afternoon to hear from her how it had gone. The visit was scheduled for 1:15, so I expected it to end around 1:40 or 1:45 at the latest. After that, it was a short trip back to the office and we would find out if he had closed the deal or not. But then 2 p.m. passed and there was no sign of Valeria. Then 2:30 passed and there was still no sign of her. We went from being excited to hear it to being impatient and finally worried. We tried to call her at home, but there was no answer. Eventually, the end of office hours came and we still hadn't heard from Valeria. So I assured the girls that I would keep calling her outside of office hours and that I would let them know what I found out as soon as I found out. I know that might seem like an overreaction, but it was completely unusual for Valeria to just disappear like that, and we knew something must be wrong. I got home and kept calling Valeria's home every half hour or so. I left at least 3 different messages on his answering machine asking him to call me back. Finally, when it was around 10 o'clock at night, my phone rang and I struggled with the urge to ask if it was Valeria as soon as I answered, but I could have asked for her name because it was her, and the relief I felt at first was enormous. I had gotten it into my head that she had been hit with some sort of medical emergency, so just hearing her voice and having her tell me she was okay was a huge relief. But then I could feel in his voice that he wasn't right. She simply meant that she was fine physically, but mentally she was clearly something else. I remember telling him that he didn't have to tell me what had happened. He just needed to know how long he needed to recover. But I also told him that if he wanted to tell me what happened, if he wanted to tell me something to pass on to the rest of the team, he was fine with that too. She told me everything, how she had been talking to the police for the last few hours, how she felt she needed a few days off, but no more than that. But most importantly, she told me the reason why she spoke to the police and the reason why she needed those days off to recover, and it all started with that visit that afternoon. We were all waiting for some kind of major player to show up at the visit. As I had already mentioned, the apartment in question was priced at thousands of pesos a month, so when a fairly normal man showed up and made his presentation as the prospective tenant, Valeria said she was a little surprised. Obviously, you can never judge a book by its cover, especially when it comes to real estate. I knew a lot of very solvent buyers who dressed poorly, and Valeria knew them too, so she knew how to treat them best and give them the five-star treatment she would give someone in a three-piece suit. The man was badly shaved, wearing a waterproof jacket, faded jeans, and dirty sneakers, but Valeria said that he greeted her with confidence and determination. So she simply continued with the visit as usual. The apartment in question was 1 or 2 floors above the 20th floor. It was the 21st or 22nd, I can't remember exactly, but Valeria took it there and had a little chat along the way. The man said he worked in computer science, which actually made a lot of sense and would have made a lot of sense to any property manager or real estate agent at the time. About 10 years earlier, 2 computer nerds moved from New Mexico to Monterrey and established a small company known as Microsoft, and 10 years later, Monterrey was practically awash with all kinds. IT, and a good chunk of them had a lot of money in their pockets once the company really started to take off. I'm telling you this to make it clear that by the time they arrived at the apartment, any reservations Valeria might have had about the man's style of dress had completely disappeared, as they would have been if I were the one doing the tour. They arrived at the apartment and the man asked him many financial questions. What were the estimated monthly utilities? Did the company offer a rent-to-own program? And if so, what kind of terms and value projections would it be looking for? Valeria tried to keep up with the man, but she clearly knew what he was talking about. She couldn't just dazzle him with the kitchen island or the huge floor-to-ceiling windows. I wanted concrete figures. So Valeria, being Valeria, set out to give them to her, and when she couldn't, she simply gave estimates as optimistic and tempting as possible. But then, anyway, the man begins to examine the large floor-to-ceiling windows and look out at what might be his own personal panorama of Monterrey. Valeria said she asked him if he liked the view, and he responded by asking if the windows opened. Valeria then explained that yes, through a hinge on the other side of the large center panel, all windows can be opened at the same time with the bottom slanted towards you and the top tilted outwards. The fittings were very strong and the glass was tempered and unbreakable, which meant that the apartment was practically inaccessible to anyone with young children. The person could also easily pass through the small gap if they really wanted to. But then who would do such a thing? Valeria mentioned almost all of that to the viewer, who replied that she didn't have children, so windows wouldn't be a problem. But then he looked at her with a kind of mischievous smile and said that someone as small as her could easily fit in there, right? Valeria said she thought it was a poor attempt at humor, so she returned a polite laugh, then made a comment about how she would never be in that situation. And I'm with her in that, if those windows were open, I would always keep 3 meters away at all times. I'm a real scary when it comes to heights, and I'm a piece of 3,000 pesos, that I would have to run a couple of marathons before I could even get through that gap. But then, in response to Valeria's comment about never being in that position, the man responded, "But what if someone forced you to be in that position?" Valeria was a gem, but she was not a fool, so she politely informed the viewer that she did not appreciate her style of humor and would be grateful if she refrained from making such jokes. But he began to tell her that it was not a joke and that if she really wanted to, he could force her down and push her through the gap, making it fall hundreds of meters onto the concrete below. Valeria said she felt her blood run cold, not only because of what she said, but also because of the way she said it. He didn't say it with an impassive expression. He said it as if it were the funniest idea he'd had in a while, and I suppose he was very amused because it instilled the fear of God in Valeria. She began to back away from him and instinctively looked towards the door, but that only caused the onlooker to close the gap between them and reassure him that any attempt to escape would be futile. Valeria reminded the guy that we had his name and contact details, but this only made him burst into laughter. He asked if he really thought he was stupid enough to use his real name to book a visit where he planned to murder the realtor. Then, Seeing the expression on her face, the guy started laughing and insulting her, calling her stupid and saying how she was much dumber than she looked. Valeria said that was the point at which she really got scared. He said he lifted his foot, took off his heel, and then took off the other before brandishing the first one like a weapon. She kept backing up, ready to at least try to defend herself. But this time the guy didn't try to follow her. She just kept laughing even louder when she saw how scared she was. Valeria hadn't been to that apartment before and had already taken note of where the bedroom and bathroom were. So she knew that with every step she took away from the viewer, it meant she was one step closer to being able to lock herself in the bathroom. And that's what he did. She turned and ran to the bedroom and closed the bathroom door behind her before turning the bolt. She said there was an obvious feeling of relief knowing she had a nice, thick door and a lock between her and that psychopath. But then seconds later something terrible came to her mind, something the guy was well aware of. He started teasing her again, laughing and saying things like, "You look, I can't wait out here all night." If this had been in a time when cell phones were commonplace, this wouldn't have been a problem, but all Valeria had was a simple pager or pager, as they were sometimes known, that could only receive messages, not send them. Valeria said that the guy knew this and kept teasing her for the better part of half an hour before things finally went quiet. He then thought it might have been safe to get out and slowly twisted the bolt on the bathroom door before opening it slightly and looking outside to see if the guy was gone. He was just sitting on the small kitchen island in complete silence, staring at the bathroom door. He had been waiting for her to come out. She didn't even rush to grab the door or anything like that. Valeria simply said that she started laughing again, saying that she didn't have to hurry, that she would wait there all night if necessary. She had to stay inside that locked bathroom for hours on end before she finally felt safe enough to get out. And yet she was completely overcome by the fear that the guy was lurking somewhere waiting for her to come out. He walked back to the elevator with his heel in his hand, still waiting to use it as a weapon to defend himself. Then, when he reached the lobby, he burst into tears when the doorman asked him if everything was okay. That was the time the police were informed, and Valeria said they arrived at the building around 5:30, which was the exact time we were leaving the office, still worried about her. It disgusted me to think that for that brief time when we were a little frustrated by her supposed tardiness, she had been trapped in the bathroom by some psychopath whose idea of fun was to scare a poor, innocent young woman. So by the time we realized something was wrong, it might have been too late. Valeria told me, and also told this to the cops, that he really believed that all he wanted to do was scare her. I mean, if I really wanted to, and maybe I had gotten a few bumps from that heel before it happened, but that guy could have overpowered her, opened that window and thrown her, or not even that. He could have attacked her when she wasn't expecting it, and she could never have left that apartment alive. But that's the only thing he didn't. He liked the idea of her being afraid. That's what made him laugh so much. That's what turned him on. I can't imagine how scary that experience must have been for poor Valeria, but incredibly, she was back at work in just a few days. She said she realized that if his whole goal was to make her feel scared, staying curled up at home would be exactly what he wanted her to do. His only frustration was that the police never caught the guy. He would have only been charged with harassment and maybe issuing a deadly threat or something, and he probably would have gotten away with it. But still, it would have been a small amount of justice for all the terror it caused Valeria. For me, it's frustrating to know that people like that exist in the first place. I can't even imagine how sick a person has to be in their head to be able to consider cheating and terrorizing random women to be one of their hobbies. I only hope that justice will catch up with him one day and reach him. Story 3. Before I officially started my business, I used to work as a guy for everything very casually. I had just left the county and was determined to get my life back on track, but I barely had 2 cents in my pocket, so I started making a living with what I could get. About 6 months later, I already had my own van, my own tools, and had everything except a contractor's license. But that didn't stop me at all from building my business and growing my income. About a year later, I was basically working as if I was on hold for a landlord who operated multiple properties throughout the city, some in nice areas and some not so much. Actually, I wasn't on hold, we just joked that it gave me so much work that I could have been. One day he asked me if he could put some veneers in some old cabinets, so I said yes. I took the address of the place he wanted me to visit and went there the next day in the morning to do it. The tenant of the apartment I was working in had been asked to vacate for the duration of the job, so I was free to do my thing, which for the most part involved applying a super strong adhesive to the cabinets before carefully laying down the veneers. I was halfway through work when I heard the key turning in the lock on the apartment door. I waited until the tenant was around and then apologized for the smell of the glue, which at that time was still quite strong and thick in the air. A second later, a woman in her 30s and 40s appeared at the door and looked at me with big wild eyes before asking where I was. He was still halfway up a staircase at the time, so he was halfway around when I asked him back where what was. Instead of answering me, she suddenly became very angry, stomped to the center of the room, and said word for word, "Tell me, or I'll kick you off that damn staircase." I felt incredibly vulnerable after that, so I started to go down quickly, hoping that I was just bluffing, or if I actually kicked the ladder, I would have less of a fall and less chance of actually hurting myself. I expected some kind of confrontation when I got to the ground, so I felt my adrenaline start to build as I stepped down from that last railing and turned to face her. But by the time I did, she was gone. He had left in the sense that he was no longer in front of me, and he had left in the sense that whoever had just spoken to me was also gone. She fell to her knees, grabbed the tube of open industrial adhesive she'd been using, and began inhaling deep puffs of the fumes from her nose. I must have asked her something like, "What the heck, ma'am?" And then I reached to grab her shoulder to try and pull her away from that. But the moment I touched her, she turned and there was a totally different person looking back at me. The woman who came into her apartment had been rude and confrontational, but the woman looking at me now looked like she could rip my liver out, eat it raw, and then ask for more. He yelled, "Get your hands off me," pushed me away, and then inhaled again the tube of industrial glue that had been at the base of the staircase. And I mean it when I say it was like a transformation. His eyes were different, still angry but full of something else as well. She was like a mountain lioness. If a person got too close to their young, they would be completely rabid. And although it was small enough for me to throw away, I must admit that at the time I was damn terrified. She kept inhaling the glue until all that anger seemed to fade from her. Then, when he was done with the tube of glue still in his hand, he got up, walked to his couch and slumped down there, looking completely gone, as if he didn't even know where he was. I remember telling him that I was going to pick up my things, put them in the van, and get out of there, and that I would have to deal with his landlord if he wanted me to put the rest of the cabinet locks on him. She just moaned and waved her hand at me as if to say, "Get out of the way," and so I did, with her lying there like a zombie. I packed my things and got out of there before I decided I wanted to help myself with the rest of my team. I also left it with that tube of adhesive. That thing might be expensive, but there was no way I could risk him ripping my face off trying to get it out of his hand. I packed my things, trying to get as much as possible towards the van in case the tenant who smelled glue decided to steal something. I managed to carry everything except my ladder under my arms. Then, on the way, I began to hear a child crying. There's no way to know how long I'd been crying, but I guess I just filtered it out as background noise as I tried to avoid being torn apart by that crazy woman smelling glue. But then, when I came out, I saw where the crying was coming from. There was a car right there on the curb with the driver's door and the rear passenger's door open. In the back, there was a child still strapped into the car seat and was yelling, "Mom, Mom," over and over again. There were also shopping bags on the way to the apartment, as if the woman had come home, seen the van, and rushed inside after abandoning both her shopping bags and her son. Maybe she just forgot I was going to spend that day and rushed inside to check it out before taking her son and her groceries inside. I'm not sure, but anyway, she walked in, The smell of the adhesive hit her, and then that's all she had on her mind. And that was the scariest thing of all. Far more terrifying than the prospect of that crazy woman smelling glue tearing my face off. This woman was such a degenerate drug addict that with a single small smell of industrial adhesive, she disappeared. Hell, she could have been the mother of the year before she walked into that room, and then, boom, she went back to the bottom of the barrel, getting high again. Honestly, I don't know what his situation was, and I shouldn't speculate. I just hope your son is okay, because with such a mother, life is sure to be uphill. Story 4. After I got out of the Marines, I found work at a property management company as their man for everything. I moved furniture, did small DIY jobs, and was occasionally called upon to help clean up the apartment of some despicable tenant who had vandalized it, either deliberately or because of their pitiful lifestyle excuse. The worst of all was a small rental house on a very nice street in a really nice neighborhood. My employer had already warned me that it would be bad. She had barely taken a few steps when the smell made her recoil, and she knew it must be serious. Maybe even so bad as to be a corpse. So she called me to help her. I met Rosa, the kindest Filipino woman, and then I went inside first to make sure there were no dead bodies inside. At the time I knew almost nothing about the previous tenants, only that they had disappeared after I stopped paying rent. I searched all the rooms and the place was absolutely disgusting, but I was sure there were no dead bodies inside. Then I told Rosa and the girls that it was safe to go in. The only thing was that they needed to put on all the protection possible. Masks, gloves, etc., because inside one of the rooms upstairs there was a huge pile of used diapers. I'm not talking about a pile of 5 or 6 in a corner. I'm talking about a pyramid-shaped pile that was at least waist deep, and I'm not exaggerating at all. The division of labor was such that anything big and heavy that needed to be taken out was my responsibility, but anything that could be moved by hand, including the pile of diapers, was the responsibility of Rosa and the girls. So, aside from taking a look, I didn't confront the diaper pyramid and only heard past comments from Rosa and the girls, one of which was something like, "What a big baby." I, with my low IQ, assumed they were talking about the size of the child's bowel movements or the number of diapers in that pile. I suppose in my most disturbing dreams, I would never have guessed exactly what that lady meant by big baby. Only later, when I spoke to the employer, did I really realize what had been happening in that house. I mentioned something about there being no place to have a child in such a filthy, disgusting place, and my employer said something like family. The rent had been for one person, just this lonely guy, and the comment about the big baby was because those diapers were the size of adults. The guy had been wearing those diapers, taking them off and then just throwing them into the pile in the same room where he slept. And I don't know about you, but that's probably the grossest and most disturbing thing you can conceive. I don't know what happened to that guy, nor do I really want to know. I just hope he got help, because boy did he need it. You're stinky but needs it. Many years ago, when I was in college, I was working as a property manager in a 100-unit apartment complex here in Guadalajara. It was a pretty good job where the company covered all of my rent, and the only really demanding thing they expected of me was filling out forms and scheduling maintenance workers. The place had a fairly equal mix of tenants. Lots of college students along with a bunch of bachelors and grad roommates, and the occasional young family. But there was one guy I always felt a little sorry for. He didn't seem to have a family, and I think he might have been disabled, but he stayed away, and the most he saw was when he went to a nearby convenience store once or twice a week. Around June of my sophomore year there, I received a call from one of the tenants in his building complaining that there was a strange smell coming from his apartment. I walked in, and it smelled like someone had thrown up in the hallway, and since there were a handful of college students in that building, that was actually a pretty depressing and common occurrence. We had the carpet cleaned the next day, and then the cleaners used a bunch of that industrial-strength shaking vac that always makes the place smell like a hotel. Once that was done, I honestly thought it would be the end, but then, I think it was 3 or 4 days later, I got calls from 50 tenants saying the smell had only gotten worse. I remember sitting in my car trying to figure out what the hell was going on when suddenly my cell phone started ringing. Remember the lonely man who looked sickly that I just told you about? The one I only saw walking to the store from time to time? Well, the caller turned out to be that guy's daughter, calling from Michoacan. Her father hadn't answered her phone in a few weeks, and she was starting to worry about him. Could I go see him to make sure he had simply lost his cell phone or something? I said I would comply with his request and then went to his building just to do that. As I walked, I joined 2+2. It was summer. There was a bad smell in the building, and nothing had been heard from the sickly loner in a while. I immediately called my on-call maintenance man and told him about the call, and he also thought we were both about to have a really bad day. We met, climbed to the guy's flat, and surely, the smell hit us like an absolute freight train. Then, when we managed to open the door of the loner's apartment, the smell was considerably stronger. We knocked on the door a few times, and to this day, I'm not entirely sure why we did. I guess it was just a last attempt at hope before we had to face the reality in front of us. But when we got no response, I opened the door, and all we could hear was the constant buzzing of all the flies in the apartment. I immediately closed the door, walked out of the building with the maintenance guy behind me, and we slowly came up with a plan of action. Then, in less than an hour, police were on the scene, closely followed by firefighters and, eventually, the county medical examiner. Apparently, the guy died of some sort of natural causes probably 3 to 4 weeks earlier, and by that time the temperature was regularly about 32 or 35 degrees outside, so in an apartment with no air conditioning, I was cooking him at about 37 to 40 degrees. It was practically a puddle when we got to it. The cost to recover the apartment was close to 900,000 pesos. They stripped it down to the studs, every strand of carpet, every appliance, every cabinet, every piece of plaster was ripped off and replaced. That whole odyssey was how I found out that there are actually companies that specialize in cleaning human remains, and I also learned that they are not cheap. Even after that, there was always a slight smell in the apartment, and trying to rent it back was an odyssey in itself. A few years ago, my roommate Chloe and I moved into the perfect apartment in a 6-unit building. It was on a street that we fell in love with immediately. Chloe and I are in our 20s, moving from a small town to a major city in the last 5 years, so we felt like real adults living in this place. Within the first few weeks, we began to suspect that we were in close proximity to an ongoing domestic dispute between the tenants of the upstairs unit. At the time, we hadn't seen or met them, so we really had no idea of the context of the relationship. A man's loud, angry screams with an abundance of insulting and aggressive comments, answered by inaudible murmurs, led us to think that perhaps a woman was in a potentially violent environment. Chloe and I decided to try to listen in case things got out of hand and maybe try to offer help to the woman in the meantime, if we ever knew her. For the next 6 weeks, we kept listening to him, but we hadn't seen anyone and there had been no real developments. When he was really high, we tried to record him on our phones. One Sunday afternoon, I was home alone cleaning my kitchen, which was located in the back of our unit. The man upstairs was having a very loud and long discussion, and for the first time I heard a clear answer. I could make out a woman's voice telling her to shut up and leave her alone, in a tone almost annoyed rather than fearful. He didn't like that and started yelling at her, which eventually led to him banging something on her floor. Eventually, it got so loud that the lights in my kitchen started flickering. I could see debris falling from the ceiling. This scared me and I called my boyfriend Jose. When Jose answered, I whispered into the phone, "Don't say anything, just listen." The man upstairs kept screaming, but it wasn't until there was another bang that Jose could hear. I told him on the phone, "That's my upstairs neighbor. It's been like this for a long time. I've been trying to record some of this. This is where the story really takes a turn." Considering how clearly we could hear him above, it made sense that he could hear what was being said below him. The 6 units were connected by a staircase on the outside at the rear of the building. I heard very loud footsteps running down. The next thing I knew, there were 3 loud knocks on my door and an angry voice said, "Then you can record my conversations, but you can't answer the door." I was instantly paralyzed and worried that he was coming through the window where I was standing. After about 20 seconds, I heard the footsteps return upstairs and that familiar voice said, "There's no one home." I picked up my things from the shock and fear of what had just happened and left my apartment to make some calls. I decided to call my landlord first, as it seemed like he would know what to do if we had issues with another tenant, and was very confused about what was going on. I told him the timeline of events since we moved in, and he provided me with some very interesting information. The tenants who lived above us were a mother and son, Monica and Ivan. Ivan was 36 years old, and he and his mother had been living in the building for 10 years. During that time, Ivan had never had a job and in recent years had caused some problems for the landlord. Specifically, he and the previous tenant of our unit, who had moved out over a year ago, had had several confrontations, leading the landlord to decide not to mention anything to us. I knew Ivan had some problems, but he assumed it was an isolated and uncontained problem. The last thing the landlord had told me was that while the previous tenant was in our unit, Ivan had approached him accusing her of installing something on his wall to listen to him. Maybe it's silly, but this didn't cause immediate alarm. Something more serious was happening with Ivan. I still believed that the woman's voice I heard belonged to someone in danger, so I called the city's non-emergency hotline, which sent a car to make sure she was safe. He was, and they left quickly after our call. The landlord began putting together a case to evict my upstairs neighbors for the fact that they were hindering another tenant's ability to enjoy their space. Things upstairs had been mostly quiet for 2 days, until I contacted the landlord again on the phone. He provided me with more information, specifically that he believed that when Ivan was angry, it was towards the previous occupant of our unit rather than Monica. This obviously seemed odd to me, but we were still trying to put all the pieces together, so we had to keep an open mind. The landlord also reiterated how Ivan really changed in recent years and had caused problems before. His reasoning for not letting us know before we moved in was that since the last tenant had moved out, he had been quiet and kept away. In the days following this call, the screams resurfaced as we waited for an update on the eviction process. That night, while I was in bed, I heard Ivan's voice from above saying, "Shoo, I'm trying to listen." At this point, I was definitely worried, but I really had no idea how this was going to end and how quickly. The next afternoon, Chloe called me while I was at work and told me she thought she heard a knock on our back door. I told her I wouldn't be home for a couple of hours, but if she was worried, she could leave early or call the non-urgent line. Chloe told me that she would see if something happened and that it would be fine. Around 10 p.m., I got home and by midnight I was on the phone with the non-urgent line myself because Ivan had gone down to my back window where I was standing, asking us to leave him alone because we were harassing him. Chloe and I had been in our kitchen talking about our days, having agreed to try to live our lives despite the situation. At one point, the topic of upstairs came up briefly, and the next thing I knew, the man I had only seen once physically, with dark, greasy hair and a look of emptiness in his eyes, was standing by my back window where I was sitting. My immediate response was to pull out my phone and start recording it. "Yes, you can record me," he said. "Can you and your friends leave me alone? They harass us at home every day." This made my adrenaline increase, and suddenly I heard myself saying, "Goodbye, Ivan." I called the police and we waited for them to arrive. When he came back upstairs, he began to vent to Monica and said some very strange and disturbing things. He said we were sexually harassing him and that we, the landlord and the previous tenant, were all associated. Then he mentioned the bat we have next to our back door, which he would not have seen in the window, therefore he had heard us mention it. He also knew my name, having seen me only once. The police came and basically told us there was nothing they could do. They knocked on Ivan and Monica's door, but no one answered and they remained silent. The officer recommended that we go to the station the next day and that we be assigned to a specific officer to check and monitor everything. They left and I called my boyfriend to come and stay overnight. In the hour after the police left, Ivan began to vent sporadically, repeating much of the same stuff we'd been hearing over the past week. Joseph came and heard for himself what was happening and agreed that it was very disturbing. Knocks were heard from above and Jose said that he was going to go out at the back to smoke, and that if Yvonne went outside, he should call the 911. Jose had hurt his back the week before and was worried that Ivan would try to go down again. He decided to take the bat with him. Minutes later, Ivan had come out and was standing at the top of the stairs screaming that he was going to hit us. He began to go downstairs when Jose raised the bat and told Yvonne to stay upstairs. I called 911 and our neighbor downstairs came out to help us, having heard the commotion. The police arrived and I experienced some of the saddest minutes of my life. To begin with, when the police went up this time, Monica responded and fully defended her son. The woman we were initially concerned about was at the end of domestic abuse told the officers not to leave her son, who had almost been attacked by my boyfriend, alone. The police said there was nothing they could do and they left us for what we felt was an eternity. To have our concerns taken seriously, we left. We hear Ivan rise again. This time, he was saying that he was going to kill this one below. We packed up and left for the night, each staying with a friend. That was a difficult night, as we both realized that this apartment that we thought was perfect had a pretty fatal flaw. We had no idea how this was going to end. We met the next day, and after encouragement from our families, we went to the police station needing real help with a potentially dangerous situation. He was finally angry that charges would be filed against Yvonne for making death threats. Chloe and I gave testimony. Then the officers told us they would go to the apartment to arrest Ivan. We were advised not to stay there that night if possible, in case he refused to be taken by them, as this could escalate things without an order. The police had no way of forcing Ivan to go with them, but I had a feeling that he would, as I heard him at one point saying that he was the only one protecting his home. Sure enough, when the police arrived at the building, we packed bags for the night. I even let him be taken away, despite his mother's protests, which included accusing us of lying and threatening them. We packed up our things, watched him get taken away, and left, never spending another night in that apartment. Since all of this, there have been a few updates. First of all, we moved out and the landlord was very generous in his refund to us, having known that Ivan had problems and greatly underestimated them. In addition to not wanting to be sued, I truly believe that the landlord is a decent person who simply made a decision that went completely wrong. We received some updates on the legal proceedings, both on the charges filed and on the eviction process of Monica and Ivan's landlord. Ivan was released the next day on bail with a number of conditions, and we are awaiting a trial date. I assume that the landlord is also waiting for a trial date after having filled out all the pre-required paperwork. The final piece of this sequence of completely bizarre events was the Facebook profile we found when searching for it on a whim. Ivan hadn't posted in 3 years, which matched the timeline in which the landlord said he started causing trouble. I had some disturbing posts that we provided to the police, plus frequent mentions of a relationship I was in, with dozens of posts about the person going unanswered, including a lack of likes on any of them. They are strictly posts aimed at an anonymous person who had no interactions or anyone else. After researching what I think Ivan is suffering, I wonder if this relationship ever existed or if it was another illusion.